Welcome everybody to the webinar Symbiosis, Inspiring Partnerships and Stewardship. Partnership is fundamental to ILCN, ELCN's core business, private land conservation. In its most basic form, private land conservation is about partnering with private landowners, reaching out to them, working with them on joint projects, supporting them with help and advice. And when private owners take the initiative, partnership will also come into play. Owners will often be looking for professional expertise, anything from scientific to legal, to achieve the conservation dream. But besides these bilateral partnerships, there are other forms of land conservation partnership. That's what today's webinar is about. For instance, partnerships with whole communities, combining rural development, new jobs, and biodiversity conservation. Our first speaker, Natasha Wilson from South Africa, will explain that. Or partnership with ordinary citizens who are not conservation professionals, but keen to roll up their sleeves and do something worthwhile for their community. That's our second presentation by Mel Galbraith, New Zealand. Or multilateral partnerships, communicating with as many of the local social groups and stakeholders in the local population as can be reached. Edmund Staal from the Netherlands will discuss this in the third presentation. The three presentations are a sample. Many partnerships are possible, even with groups you wouldn't spontaneously associate with conservation. Partnerships are crucial if we want to broaden the appeal of land conservation, build political and social support for it. New partners also mean different perspectives, fresh ideas, a more biodiverse private land conservation ecosystem. Enough philosophy. Time to hand the mic to the presenters, who will explain this better and with prettier pictures. Natasha, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. It's awesome to be here and to share our South African perspective. I'm going to speak about how biodiversity stewardship in South Africa can support rural livelihoods through partnerships. Next slide. So just a quick overview of my presentation. I'm going to touch on the South African context, a little bit about our land story. I'll touch on our biodiversity richness and some of the threats to that. And then I'll speak to the Biodiversity Stewardship program in South Africa and how we try to support rural livelihoods through that body of work. I'll touch on the Nambiti case study and finish off. So South Africa is a young democracy. We're only 26 years old. We also have a developing country context, which is quite different to North America and the European context. It also means that government has very specific priorities and challenges, specifically around capacity and resource constraints in driving our development agenda. We also struggle significantly with issues of corruption. On top of that, we've got high levels of unemployment and inequality and poverty that we're trying to deal with. So just a little bit about our land story. Just over 10% of South Africa's land is arable. A whopping 80% of our land is privately or communally owned. Our land ownership model takes the form of private land, which includes commercial land, rural communities, communally owned land in a community trust or a CPA. And a CPA is a communal property association that allows a group of landowners to acquire, hold, or manage property in line with the constitution. And the reason why this is important is because with our apartheid history and legacy, people were removed from their land, and we needed to find ways of rectifying those wrongs. And how do we enable communities and groups of people to own land together? And having a CPA or a land trust is one of those ways. Next slide. So South Africa does have unprecedented levels of biodiversity. Just about 10% of our land is formally conserved. We've got high levels of species, high levels of endemism, and a variety of ecosystem types. We're known to be one of the third most biodiverse countries in the world, with 3 biodiversity hotspots, the Suckland Karoo, the Cape Floral region, and the Maputoland, Pondoland, Albany hotspot. Then just a little bit about the threats and our ecosystem protection levels. Over 2/3 of the ecosystem types fall within a protected area network in South Africa. So 31% is not protected. 14% of plants are considered threatened. 12% of our animals are considered threatened, and 63% of plants and animals are considered well protected. Threats to our biodiversity is nothing new. We deal with significant issues around invasive aliens, land degradation through agriculture, and of course, the issues associated with climate change. Thanks. So just a little bit about our Biodiversity Stewardship Program. Biodiversity Stewardship in South Africa is an approach to securing high priority biodiversity land. We do that by entering into voluntary agreements with landowners, and this initiative is driven by our provincial conservation agencies, and it is supported significantly by the NGOs in the country, the conservation NGOs in the country. Our Land Reform and Biodiversity Stewardship Initiative is a conservation and development initiative that's driven by environmental affairs, land reform, and rural development, as well as the South African National Biodiversity Institute. And the idea there is to support communal landowners, previously disadvantaged landowners who have high priority biodiversity on their land, to support them with managing both the conservation and development aspects of their land. And it really is an opportunity to stimulate rural development. So a little bit about our principles. We focus on priority biodiversity areas because we have limited resources. It's voluntary commitment. The landowners need to be willing to participate with this initiative. A significant amount of emphasis placed on cooperative governance and partnerships, and it takes the form of contractual agreements that finds its home in contract law and our National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act. There's a strong landowner focus and a strong focus on extension support to these landowners. I just want to touch on the significance of partnerships, in that we have quite a strong community of practice where we've got a group of provincial agencies, NGOs, and other partners who come together to share lessons learned, to deal with legal issues, technical issues. And there's quite a lot of sharing between the organizations and the individuals in terms of learning about how to better implement biodiversity stewardship. And of course, the partnership with the most important aspect, which is the landowner. So because of the land reform initiative, there are new landowners being created, and they do often have exceptional biodiversity on their land, which is often communally owned. And the Biodiversity Stewardship Initiative recognizes landowners as the custodians of their own. Stewardship programs can have benefits for communal landowners, and we are also able to support landowners with their commercial enterprises. Next slide, thanks. So as I said, landowners who enter into biodiversity stewardship, there are benefits from conserving their land. It's often in the form of advice to landowners in terms of dealing with the conservation aspects and managing those conservation aspects. A biodiversity assessment is done, support and with developing a management plan. assistance with land management in the form of clearing invasive alien species or fire management, erosion control, and in time communities will see the benefits of healthier ecosystems, specifically less erosion and more productive land. So where there are feasible commercial enterprises, the initiative can support communities in terms of developing business plans and receiving training, as well as connecting them to strategic partners, specifically funding partners. And doing biodiversity stewardship can bring through significant jobs on these properties, particularly in the land management space. So I want to talk a little bit about the Nambiti Game Reserve. Most of this information I received by our NGO partner Conservation Outcomes. And Nambiti is situated in KwaZulu-Natal province in South Africa. It's on the northeast coast of South Africa. Next slide. The reserve is about just under 10,000 hectares large. It's a Big Five reserve. It was subject to a successful land claim and is owned by the Senzone Course Community Trust. What that means is that it was owned by previous white landowners, and the community was then allocated that land and is now the owner of that land. It was declared as a nature reserve under the stewardship program in 2013. And it's a successful ecotourism and wildlife ranching venture that benefits from the biodiversity on the property. And it also includes a range of business activities. So there's 10 luxury game lodges catering for tourists. They have a live sale of game. They produce venison or game meat from the abattoir and the butchery. And it's a really good model of cooperation between the community and the private sector. So the reserve generates a monthly turnover of 4 million. It's quite significant in terms of the local community and creating jobs. It employs more than 220 people, and it's a lot more jobs than would have been possible under conventional agriculture. Also at higher salaries because it's not unskilled labor. They work in lodges, and a little bit of skill is required to be working in those spaces. And this case study also contributes significantly to biodiversity conservation because of the vegetation types and wetlands and species found on the property. I wanted to just mention a little bit about the beneficiaries. So the beneficiaries were 136 people that put in a land claim for this property, and they had lived in the community previously and then were removed from that land, and they successfully got the land back. This is also what's useful to mention is the leadership that was shown in terms of this case study, in that the previous landowners, when they understood that the land was under land claim, they decided to work with the Land Claim Commission and with the community. And there was a lot of leadership shown both on the part of the community who were to inherit the land, as well as the old landowners. And I think that was quite a significant shift in how land claims are resolved. So that just shows a significant level of partnership between the new landowners and the previous landowners, as well as the role that the other thing to note is that it was also quite a successful game reserve before it became a stewardship site. I think that's also one of the reasons why it was quite successful, because there was already quite significant private sector investment onto the property. There's also a significant business model where the 10 lodges that I mentioned are actually subdivided and individually owned. And those private individuals pay the community to be able to do game drives and access the property. So there's a sharing of profits there. And also from a governance perspective, two of the community members do sit on the board, and they are part of decision making and the sharing of power. They've attended courses on what being a board member entails, and so that I think is also quite an important aspect of the success of this case study. You know, the question is, why did they choose to go for conservation? You know, what other options were there? The land was quite marginal in terms of traditional agriculture. There was a bit of maize and cattle farming before it became a game reserve, and conservation really was the best land use in this instance. Conserving biodiversity was the best thing, and you could get the best returns in terms of a business model using the landscape as it was. Also, I mentioned about 220 jobs currently. Before it was a game farm, it only employed around 20 people. So there's significant increase in jobs. And in South Africa, we've just done some work around job creation in the biodiversity conservation sector. And it is shown that to date, biodiversity delivers more jobs to our economy than mining, which is an interesting piece of work given our heavy mining economy in the past. And then there isn't that much conflict with this community. Most of the conflict comes up from outside of the community, where a lot of the people who do not form part of this land claim wish to receive some of the benefits. Because they are not part of the community, they are second place in terms of receiving jobs and that kind of thing. And then just lastly to note that each beneficiary receives a payment twice a year, so they are able to share in the profits of this business venture on a regular basis. Next slide. So some of the benefits for the community is around land ownership, which is quite significant, economic development and rural development in the area, employment, food security, and SAMBI and the community of practice continues to support this work with learning exchanges and training and capacity building. So just in conclusion, there's still a lot of work that we need to do in terms of showing the value of biodiversity stewardship within the South African government and to private investors. Going forward, we've got a GEF7 project that looks at biodiversity stewardship and the biodiversity economy, which is predominantly looking at how biodiversity stewardship can support rural development. We've also got a biodiversity finance initiative project where we're trying to unlock fiscal resources for the implementation of stewardship, with the argument that it is more than a protected area expansion tool and that it can also support the development agenda of our country. And then we continue with capacity building for both landowners as well as extension officers, and to continue developing the community of practice. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Natasha. That was a really interesting socio-political context and history. And you touched on several forms of partnership in your presentation. And well, this figure of 220 jobs, you know, it's more than if the land had been used for commercial agriculture. That's very interesting, I think, very interesting indeed. So now we go to a completely different example in New Zealand. Mel, it's your turn to go.
Thank you, Anton, and good morning, everyone from New Zealand. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about my favourite island, Tiritiri Matangi Island. I've been involved with this restoration project for the last 36 years, so a bit difficult to condense a small story into 15 minutes. Next. So just the overview of the island to start with, and perhaps the New Zealand context, talk about the community group, supporters of Tiritiri Matangi, and talk about the relationship with the Department of Conservation, because it is a government-owned island. It's or Crown land, as we talk about it. It is a scientific reserve, so it has quite a special status within our biodiversity protection system. Next. So first of all, to give you the context of where we are, not sure if you've seen the world like this before, but the reason for showing this is just to emphasise the isolation of New Zealand. We are sort of a landmass that has got a lot of sea around it. It is the last landmass on the planet to be colonised by people, about 800 to 900 years ago. But of course, the isolation has given us a very characteristic, unique biodiversity, and the arrival of people has had a huge impact on that biodiversity. Next. Perhaps New Zealand, as you are more likely to know it. This is the impact that I was sort of mentioning, the pre-human and then time of European colonisation and current. This is just the vegetation. New Zealand was largely covered in forests, and now most of those have gone. But in addition to taking away all the vegetation, next, people have brought in all these warm, furry things. New Zealand biota evolved without mammals. The only endemic mammals we have or had were 3 species of bats, and of course all the coastal, the seals, whales and seals, but no land mammals. And consequently, the birds were dominated by birds, a lot of ecological equivalents taking up mammal roles. But these mammals, the predators, the herbivores, just had a huge impact on New Zealand species, many of which, both birds and invertebrates, are flightless. Next. So we're going to focus on northern New Zealand. We have islands right throughout New Zealand, over 600 islands or more that have been, the word that's been used is lifeboats for our wildlife, because they've helped to minimise the impact that's happened on the mainland. Next. So just zooming in on that square, Auckland City is the largest city of New Zealand, and the island I'm going to talk about is Tiritiri Matangi, which is it's no scale there. It's about 20 kilometres from the city. The significance of that is that it's 20 kilometres from this human concentration, and as you'll see, that's been very important. Next. So the island, typical of most inshore islands, suffered extreme degradation, and so it's typical of what happened to New Zealand. Next. So this is a photo of the island taken before it became a reserve. It was farmed at that time. The farming allowed them to burn the island off. So the Polynesian colonists would have modified the environment. Europeans arrived and modified it even further. So as you can see, very little forest there, and that forest had stock could wander all through it. So it's just highly degraded. Next. So in the 1970s, it was gazetted as a scientific reserve. Most scientific reserves in New Zealand are accessed by permit only, but the Tiritiri was a little bit different. It was allowed to be accessed by people as an open sanctuary. And it was at the time a University of Auckland Field Research Station, and 2 lecturers in particular, Professor John Craig and Dr. Neil Mitchell, were the people who instigated the open sanctuary concept and then ultimately triggered the restoration. Now that started in 1984 with volunteers just paying for their own transport to head out to the island to plant trees. They were sourced from anyone who was interested, environmental societies like Birds New Zealand, youth groups, Sea Scouts, and Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, service clubs, Lions, Rotary, school groups, and even church groups, were people just going out, taking a day trip out to the island to plant trees. Next. And so the 3 photographs of the same view that give you an idea of what has happened. So obviously the farming days, top left, and then the bottom left is 6 years after the planting started, and then the 2000 photo showing the canopy. And I can't take a photo there now, all you'd see is one tree. So it was definitely a community initiative and a community contribution on Crown land. Next. So here's the impact. It's again 2000 photo, but it still looks very much the same today, just that the canopy is thickening and undergrowth coming in underneath. So 300,000 plants over 10 years. And in the first 5 years, Professor John Craig estimated that volunteer input is valued at New Zealand, 1 million New Zealand dollars. So when you think about conservation globally, that sort of money available is not available to contribute to small places. So the volunteer input has been absolutely crucial for this restoration project. Next. So the plants weren't just any old plants decided to go in. It was quite a deliberate replanting. We have very few endemic seed eaters in New Zealand. Most of our birds are frugivores or insectivores or nectar feeders. And so the planting reflected that. Next. Just some of our endemics, the nectar feeders are tui at the left, bellbird at the bottom, and our large native pigeon, which is a frugivore. Next. One of the things that the restoration has allowed, is, of course, is to for the island to become a significant, play a significant role in helping threatened species. All of these photos here are of threatened species. The kiwi and the takahe, bottom left, bottom right, are flightless, and of course they are highly threatened against some of those efficient mammals, the mustelids. The saddleback and kōkako are weak flyers, but they're an endemic. These are all endemic New Zealand species, and you're probably quite interested in the top 2 on the middle and right. The tuatara is a remnant of the pre-dinosaur reptiles and survived in New Zealand and now mainly on offshore islands. But the one in the middle, the weta punga, is the giant weta, is really just a giant cricket without wings. It's heavily armor plated, as you can see. That's actually my hand that it's sitting on. It's a female. I think it's one of the world's heaviest insects. But all of those are very vulnerable to the impacts of people. So with the next, please, with the restoration and then the removal of just back one. So, and the removal of the predators, the Pacific rat, then the island's conservation value just skyrockets, and particularly for invertebrates. Next. It is sad that a key element of conservation in New Zealand is actually managing these invasive mammal predators. So that's sort of the Tiri restoration story and its value today as a conservation island. But let's start looking at the relationship. So the restoration of Tiritiri Matangi started before the New Zealand Department of Conservation was formed. There were other government departments that were managing the island, but the New Zealand Department of Conservation sort of came out of the New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy, which came out of the Rio conference. The year after the Department of Conservation was formed, the volunteers formed their own stewardship group, the supporters of Tiritiri Matangi. And I understand really what happened is that the people were out there planting trees. Someone said, can we, said to the ranger, we need some more spades, and he just said there's no money. And conservation in New Zealand has suffered many times through government cuts in government funding. So that was the stimulus for the stewardship group to form. Next. So the supporters was set up as they were a labour force and set up as a funding group. So all they're doing is going out there, planting trees and getting money for spades and things. But it just grew. It became an incorporated society. Now in New Zealand, that means that the society has a legal identity. It can borrow money, it can get funding, it can employ people, and it has to report back to the government annually to prove that it's doing that. And it's also gained charitable status, which means that if people give them a donation, then there are some tax relief from that. So the income is from subscriptions. People have to join the organisation, from donations. People like giving money away to certain activities. Grants, there are philanthropic organisations that give money away that we can apply for. And the concession is what you need if you're going to earn money on a Department of Conservation estate. And the supporters have a concession for guiding. So that involvement of initially from labour force and fundraising has just expanded to include management, education, advocacy. Next. So the core contributions, where the money's gone, we've built buildings, we've put money into biodiversity management. That's habitat enhancement. It includes weeds, removing the mammals, managing weeds, paying for species translocations. It's quite expensive to move species around New Zealand. Especially small birds are often moved by helicopter off islands to other islands. And there's ongoing species monitoring that the supporters are involved with. Research support with funding. The island started as a research field post, and research is still very strong on the island. And many of the volunteers are now participating in that research. And education advocacy. When the Department of Conservation was formed, they actually employed teachers, but the first restructure, the teachers were gone. So the supporters of Tiritiri Matangi have taken over that role of education advocacy. They put out some publications, they have run guided walks and talks to community groups. Next. So just run through some of these activities, the biodiversity management, the little gecko in the bottom photo is quite a significant one, because no one knew that was on the island until 11 years after the rats were removed. So it must have been just a little remnant population that was just survived, and then they just grew in numbers until we could notice them. So the photo is showing researchers from Massey University involved, and there's a couple of volunteers, supporters volunteers working with them. Top right is the hihi, or stitchbird. It is a nectar feeder, but it's an endemic family to New Zealand, sole representative in the family, and it requires supplementary feeding, and the population is a threatened species, and so volunteers are involved in providing that nectar. And the photo in the bottom right is a whole lot of nest boxes or roost boxes that have been made by volunteers and will be put up by volunteers. As you can imagine, the young forest has very few cavities, and so the species that are cavity nesters or cavity roosters need this the supplementary holes for them to live in, and that's even now there are some species like the stitchbird that still requires nest boxes to breed. Next. So the advocacy, the translocations, although they're a biodiversity management function, they also became an advocacy event where public were invited to see these animals before and then see them released. So the top right photo, as you can see, the tuatara, perhaps an 80-year-old animal. Most of these animals are all on offshore islands, so people very seldom get to see them. The takahe, this bird, it's a flightless gallinule, the largest gallinule in the world. And it was thought to be extinct until the 1940s, where a little population was found in the mountains of the South Island. And so to bring both of these species onto the island for their conservation, to boost populations, it's an opportunity for people to see them, and for the first time for many of those species. Next. The guided walks that I suspect Anton was in one of these a year or two ago. The guide in the middle with the hat, she's a volunteer. Our guides, that's about 200 guides, volunteers. They travel free on the ferry to get there, but then they look after these people. They pay for the experience, and it's a 1 to 2 hour walk. And the opportunity to enhance the experience simply through spotting birds or adding information is very valuable. Next. And of course, school visits. The island has many school visits, and here's the effect of a school visit. The tui is a large bird. It's very common throughout New Zealand, but on Tiritiri Matangi, you get up close to them. And as you can see, this is a 5-year-old's drawing of the tui, and I think you can see a Picasso influence there, but I think it's indicative of the impact that the island has for children and the conservation message. Next. So here we've got two sort of sides of the conservation. You've got the community, people who want to do something. Then you've got the government agency with a legislative obligation to get outcomes. Next. So they get support from the community, and the community is contributing labour and often the infrastructure, equipment and transport. Next. And I think the question is often asked, why do people do this? Well, they do it because they get rewards. They get part of the management, they gain knowledge, they gain access to places where they may not normally be allowed to go, and they get the experience. And for me, of course, my initial reward was, as an ornithologist, was being able to see these birds, and rather than have to get to the very difficult access offshore islands. Next. There is the problem of people often then say, well, how can we control? What are the controls? Well, the Department of Conservation and Tiritiri supporters have a memorandum of understanding so that each know what they can do and what they can't do, what's expected of them, and it sort of determines the limits. And all this is nested. Next. This is nested within legislative documents. There's a management plan and a regional strategy and then under acts of parliament. And so it's not just a free-for-all with communities. There are those checks and balances. Next. So I've tried to put this very complex relationship into this flow diagram. So we're starting off with volunteers contributing labour and materials. And as they get involved with the ecology, different people have different skills. Some get involved with the research, some get involved with the management, some get involved with guiding or talking to groups. And so obviously from this wealth of people, you've got benefits to the project. You've got this pool of skills that the department may not have access to. The community group brings in funding that the department won't have access to, and extra knowledge. And then because of all this, the volunteers start to be involved in the management and then the governance of the island. But overriding all of this, next, of course, are these rewards. This is the reason why people get involved and then stay involved. They get involved because they will have an environmental philosophy. They want to make a difference. But the minute they get involved, they start gaining ecological literacy, and then there's personal growth, and then social benefits. And the more recent literature is actually indicating that the social benefits are as much of a driver as environmental ones for people being involved. Next. So it's quite important to note that when the supporters of Tiritiri started in 1984, the late 1980s, it was controversial because this was a scientific reserve. There were scientists at the time who said that public should never be allowed onto reserves of that nature, and also public should never be involved with threatened species. Now, it's estimated to be more than 4,000 community-based community projects, and perhaps about half of them are following this sort of model where the project is on a government land, but it's the community that's actually doing most of the work and contributing in a significant way to the management and the project. Next. So Tiritiri is considered to be a successful restoration project, and that is largely because of the volunteers that have given their time and money into that project. The relationship between the supporters in Tiritiri Matangi and the Department of Conservation, that collaborative relationship, is seen as a successful model and has been repeated elsewhere in New Zealand in many cases. So just two sources of further information if you're interested. The supporters of Tiritiri Matangi website will have more information about the island than the Department of Conservation website. And 2013 there was a special issue of the New Zealand Journal of Ecology that looks at a lot of elements of the project research and contributions from public, and that's a free access that you can find in the New Zealand Ecological Society website. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mel. Yes, that brought back a lot of happy memories. I did visit Tiritiri Matangi, and it's a Garden of Eden, and you see the native birds, and many of them really up close. So if any of you ever visit New Zealand, I would recommend go there. It's worth it, absolutely. And yeah, it's a good example of a public-private partnership, and where the volunteers have organized themselves, which is quite rare, I think. I don't know many examples outside of New Zealand where you have the self-organization. And as you explained, if enough people work long enough and hard enough, they can achieve things that would cost the public authorities big budgets, which often don't have. So it's a very interesting model. And now we go, it's the turn of Edmund Staal from the Netherlands, who will talk about a very different example again. One sees a diversity in partnerships coming out in this webinar. Edmund?
Hello, Anton. Thank you for the invitation to inform you all about nature preservation in the Netherlands and how we try to do that with other people. During my lecture, I will give you a sketch of how nature preservation is organized in the Netherlands. And at the end, I'll present you 3 specific projects. The Netherlands, the next one, thank you. The Netherlands is a small and densely populated country. We are an estuary with a few rivers, of course, the sea. And because of the climate and the soil, we can intensively use all of the country. And with all those rivers, the sea harbors, and We have a lot of infrastructure for transportation. And with all those people and all those purposes, there stays a constant demand on space to develop. Next, please. Because of 7,000 years of agricultural use and a lot of people, we don't have any primal areas anymore. Our last primal forest disappeared in 1871 already. And even our sea is full of fishing boats, gas installation, windmills, and so on. Are the Netherlands a natural desert then? Certainly not. Next, please. Here you see some different landscapes of the Netherlands. And to be honest, when you look at nature reserves in the Netherlands, they nearly all are historical agricultural landscapes. Even our woods are originally planted for timber production, and still the Dutch, and they still see us as nature. That's very strange. But maybe it's, of course, compared to the busy cities, it's the tranquility over there and the biodiversity which gives us a naturally look. Because our reserves have a lot of human influences, they also have a lot of stories and a lot of history. And that gives us the possibility to connect easily with people. It's not only about nature, it's also about their history. And so that gives us the possibility to connect with the people around us. And that's also essential to be accepted by the government as a serious stakeholder. And that's very important to be a partner by planning, because we think that should be integral based. Next one, please. This is the area in the south I'm working in. So you see the Netherlands, and I'm only working in the south of the country. And that's a sort of a wing between Germany and Belgium. So it has some influences of those both countries, the landscape from those countries. The involvement of the public is also important, because we are a privately founded foundation, and half of our budget has to come out of the public. And to give you an impression, our budget in total is 15 million euros a year. So we have to get nearly 8 million from our donors. And because of our connection with the region, we even get 80 companies supporting us. So we think we are connected with the Limburg people. But you can estimate how much work it all takes to stay connected with all those people, from action groups till nature lovers, politicians, and farmers. Next, please. Here you see how densely the Netherlands are populated. That's on my part of the country. That's on the right side. On the left side, you see in green all the nature reserves, national parks, historical agricultural landscape. That doesn't mean that no one comes there. It's all open. And in a lot of those green areas, farmers are working. But you see that it's only, I think it's 15% of our area, which is a nature reserve or water. So that's really a little bit of a country. Next, please. So when you see this slide, you see how densely populated and intensively used the Netherlands are. When you see that we have more houses, industry, and infrastructure than forests and nature reserves, that gives you an idea. And 60% is still modern agriculture with a very low biodiversity. And then something about our foundation. Next, please. You see that's founded in 1931. We now have 9,000 hectares, and it's 22,000 acres of nature reserves and estates, divided over 80 properties throughout the province. A lot of monuments, all kinds of, and we are glad to have nearly 18,000 structural donators, sponsors, and the budget I always talked about. And then now I will try to describe to you the organization in the Netherlands of nature preservation. The next one, please. In 1899, the government starts with Staatsbosbeheer. I think it's sort of state forest, mainly because of the production of timber. And because the growth of the population and the technical possibilities, there are huge land reclamations, and in a high-speed tempo, large natural areas disappeared. And that's why there originates a movement to stop this destruction. And in 1905, there is an organization, an NGO, which is called Natuurmonumenten, Nature Monuments, private organization, rich people, and they try to buy those threatened landscapes. They were successful, but they were organized and based in Amsterdam. And in that time, they experienced that because of regional cultural differences, they missed chances in the periphery of the country. That's why they stimulated to create regional counterparts. And so our foundation, was born in 1931. And in a busy country, the demand for space for economical goes on. And so the pressure on nature reserves also gets on. So when we wanted to rescue those areas with the high natural value, we had to protect them by planning, but the best protection was property. So we tried to buy them, and we bought our first property in 1940. So we already have a long history. And then in the 70s, pollution became a big issue. Water pollution, air pollution, acid rain, all that kind of things. Intensification of land use goes on, and still other historical landscapes disappeared. So there was a call of action from the public. They gave us an awkward situation on the one hand, because we were talking with communities about nature reserves and school projects, for instance. And the next moment we were with the judge discussing, arguing about the polluting industry. So we created a new foundation for environmental problems and spatial planning that helped local people with all that kind of actions. And we were out of the way. So we were the nice guys and they were the bad guys. And of course, we have a lot of contact with them from the beginning. You can see that on the next slide. Sorry, I had to ask you. These are all types of people protesting against the destruction of landscape, air pollution, torturing animals, all that kind of things. And then the next one, please. You see that the Milieufederatie, that's the one, the organization we founded, helps those action groups, nearly all volunteers in their own community. And that works really good. They have a lot of members and a lot of active people as volunteer helping them. And they only have a few of paid people on the pay list. Then the next one, please. We also noticed that from the beginning of the last century, there were a lot of people active in nature education. The same we heard from New Zealand, and investigations. From the 70s, that got an impulse because air pollution, all the kind of things, people got worried. And we also noticed that there were a lot of people who wanted to help in nature as a volunteer. But a lot of farmers didn't trust us as green people. So we created, together with other people, another organization which stimulates people to go out and help in the landscape, but in the properties of farmers and landowners. They are also assisted by professionals. It should be well done. So they worked on orchards, hedges, amphibian ponds, and so on, and mostly outside the existing nature reserves. So an impressive extension of the area. And you can see a whole group of organizations who work in and next to nature reserves, but all with their own focus and niche. I'll show you now the three projects, and the first one is the next slide, please. The reintroduction of the hamster, an animal which is dependent of agricultural land, and it has the image of a pest. So it's not so nice in the area to reintroduce such an animal, but is so effectively contested in Europe that it's nearly extincted. Despite the protected status, we only had 11 specimens and only on one field. And there was a Dutch group of activists, very active, to put pressure on the government about their responsibility. And the agriculture community had no interest at all. So the activists kidnapped the 11 hamsters with a lot of publicity and put them safely in a zoo. Europe, Brussels, obliged the Dutch government to do something and find a solution. And to stimulate the government, our mother foundation, Natuurmonumenten, organized a fundraising campaign with a lot of effort and a lot of money raised for this purpose. But meanwhile, we talked with our regional government and the farmers to find potentially suitable fields. And the government asked the farmers, but that was a bridge too far. And with a lot of legal procedures, the activists built under pressure. So they were the bad guys, but for other ones, David fighting against Goliath. And at the end, the government had to do something. So they bought 50 hectares of fields and they gave it over to us, our foundation. During that period in the zoo, they breeded with the hamsters. So we had quite a lot of them. And to be based in the community, we organized a guidance group. And we made one of the regional agriculture leaders the chairman of that guidance group. In our investigations together with universities, we tried to find out what the needs of the hamster were. And we tried to do that kind of work in our fields, but it was done by farmers. So they earned money by the work they did on our fields. And we tried so to seduce farmers to do the same. But not only the hamster came back, but also a lot of birds, insects, and an old ecosystem was restored. But to be honest, there still aren't enough farmers who are partner, but we started. Second example is National Park de Maasduinen in the north of our province. This was the hamster on the south. Oh, sorry, I should have told you. The woman you saw was the minister who was introducing, freeing the woman on the right side. She came with the breeded hamsters to introduce them in the field. So we had quite some publicity then. Next one, please. And this is the biodiversity, which came back in those areas. Then the next project, please. National Park de Maasduinen for plants, animals, and people. Compared to other countries, our national parks are small. Our Maasduinen are only 10,000 acres, so that's a little bit more than 4,000 hectares. And in the Netherlands, national parks mostly are partnerships between different owners and organizations. The big landowners like State Forest and our foundation and communities are mostly the heart of the national park. And our foundation tries to do extra. And the community is in the board, and also tourist organizations and heritage organizations. And as partners, we decide about nature preservation and nature development, but also about recreational infrastructure and infocentra. Because of this partnership, there is this consultative body, and because there is no farmer active anymore within the borders of the national park, we didn't find it necessary that they were in this board. And that was a strategically bad idea. It's better to let them join the discussions and see the problems themselves, like drought and pollution by nitrogen compounds. And now they are officially a member of the board, so they have responsibility for all the choices, and they can, or better say, have to explain their fellow farmers why the decisions are made. Most people see national parks as magnets to attract tourists, so they rent services for all types of visitors. It can't be enough. And afterwards, they want to cash in by building camping sites, restaurants, and so on. But no one can force us to choose against our goals. In our view, you can do something on every spot, but you can't do everything everywhere. So after constructive talks with the community, tourism, and farmers, we made a plan to improve the landscape around the national park. It has to be so beautiful that tourists are also satisfied with this landscape for activities like mountain biking and cycling or horse riding. And we can't only go for nature and lock out the public, but we have to choose. And that's why we have to be creative to find solutions. Because of this open attitude, the national park is already twice enlarged. And we have reached the point that even the city councillor says we shouldn't build in the national park. We have to gain the money in the surrounding landscape. And he helps people to improve their landscape. A good example of integral thinking. And the last example, next please. You've seen some beautiful pictures of this area, and now there is a plan of the area. The next one, please. You see the blue stripe, one back, please. You see the green, that's the border, the front, the outside of the national park. The red stripe is a road, and the blue line is a river. And the city council wants to connect the white area between the river and the national park with the national park. So it will become one regional park. So that's really perfect. Then next one, and the last project is one further on, please. An extra, thank you. This is in the 17th century, this area looked like this: heather fields, moors and fens. And it was already in that time known as for its biodiversity. Next one. Next, please. Thank you. You see the canal on the left side, and the soil which came out of the canal was poured into the fence which were laying over there, so they disappeared. The rest dried out and got eutrophicated. And on the black and white photo on the right, you see that the fence nearly disappeared. We bought a small portion of it in the 1940s. And very special was that in the nearby village, there was a group of interested people, and the headmaster of the school was one of them. So there was quite a large group of interested people in the village. What helped was that we let them skate on the fen in the wintertime, and we asked them to take care of the birds. And what they did, they put on fences themselves. We didn't have to do it. When we later on had the possibility to buy an area next to the one of these fens, we were thinking about restoration of that fen. Universities did the investigation, and so we had a plan. We made a communication plan with the village, with the interested people, to raise money, and we asked volunteers to make an education project for the youth, and they adopted elements in the landscape around. So they worked there, got their lessons over there, and of course in such a village, a lot of those kids are kids from farmer families, so they informed their parents at home, and so they discovered that nature is fun and not just economically useless. Because we proved that nature reservation was possible, the government helped us, and we started to make a big plan together with the farmers. The filled-up fens were emptied, they were linked together, and they let the brook meander again to absorb rainwater during floods. That's good for the farmers. Other brooks were laid on other places, so out of the nature reserve, but with the water levels good for the farmers. So something for us, something for them. And the village asked for watchtowers and made an archeo route with statues, and we accepted those in the reserve because it made the reserve more lively for the community. And then we got some spin-off. We promoted afterwards the beauty of the area. And a lot of people came to visit the area. And then a farmer started an ice cream shop next to his dairy farm. And it was such a success that he built a playground. So he has a lot of visitors now. You see on the photo, the fen out, it's now one of those. And the improved biodiversity proves the effect of this reconstruction project. And as a dessert, after this nature restoration meal, the farmers accepted the removal of a whole road, which led through the fen. So this large fen is now completely restored. With these examples, you maybe think it's easily arranged in the Netherlands. Of course not. But I think we found a way of working together by combining the goals of different groups. And that's why people start to think and act. And when they want to protect nature, you have to talk with people instead of talking to. I always tell my colleagues, we keep on telling our story, but we look at it through the eyes of the other party. So you have to know the aims for the other party, so you both gain something with the support of the other, and you won't reach everything. Knowing to do is okay, but actually doing is better. Thank you.
Well, dank u, Edmund. Well, I think you people in the Limburg Landscape Foundation must be acrobats, because you have a different organization for every partnership, and you partner with with people ranging from radical activists to farmers and tourist organizations and government authorities. So that's quite a balancing act. And I'm particularly impressed by the creative campaigning, like the kidnapping hamsters, and getting to the farmers through the children at school, and the idea of co-opting, getting farmers on board so that they actually talk to you directly rather than standing there screaming from the outside. It's all very interesting, and lots of lessons there, I think. Okay, now a reminder to the audience. If you want your question to be asked live, just type it and send it. But if you do not want to ask live, but you prefer that I would ask it for you, please select anonymous before you send it. And while we're setting up the question and answer function, here's a general question to all three panelists. After these remarkable examples of partnership, I can imagine that there will be people who'd like to try to build up similar partnerships or different partnerships with communities and stakeholders and governments at home. Now, could each of you explain what's the best way to make first contact with groups, with people who haven't so far engaged in biodiversity and conservation, who may not even seem interested? How do you first get in touch with them and get them interested and committed? What works, what does not work when communicating to potential new partners? So yes, who would like to go first? Natasha or Mel?
Sure, I'm ready to go.
Yep.
So from our perspective and from my experience, I think what's important is developing a level of trust with the communities or the landowners that you wish to engage with. It's important to be relevant, to understand where they are at, what's important to your landowners, what's important to your communities, and meet them where they are at. That would be the first step. That is our approach in the stewardship work, and we find that that tends to work. Your communities or your landowners might not have biodiversity conservation as their first objective. So it's important to understand what else is important to them. They have livelihoods that they need to maintain, and it's really important to ensure that the sites are economically sustainable, because that's what's needed to look after the biodiversity. Thanks, Anton.
Okay, Mel, Edmund, who wants to go next?
Yeah, I can react if you want to, Anton. I think you have to accept that it is hard to understand that someone on the other side of the table isn't as interested in nature preservation as we are, not as motivated. And it's very hard to understand that someone is not interested in what we are doing. And we are motivated, not motivated by money. And most of the time, the purposes and the goals of the other one are connected with money. And that makes the discussion very, very, very difficult. So we try that. We do that especially with the directors of companies who gave money to us. We take them outside and we let them discover like kids how nature function, and they have fun with it. And they feel a little bit awkward together, adult people trying to fish with a little net in a pond, but then certainly one of them, we have the connection, and then it goes on, and we leave them. We just leave them. You don't have to push too much. And years after, they always tell the same stories. Oh, that was nice that time. So seduce people instead of telling them what they should do.
Okay, thank you, Edmund. Emel, your take?
Yeah, New Zealand, there's perhaps two things that's happening. One I'll just mention, which is a movement called Predator Free New Zealand 2050, which the government initiated, and a lot of communities have got on board to manage mammal predators, and that's instigated quite a lot of interest in conservation. But that's perhaps specific to New Zealand with our mammal problem. But an exercise, and it picks up on what Edmund said about getting people out and letting them see the small animals and plants, and this isn't just adults, but school children as well. An exercise that's becoming very successful is called a BioBlitz. Now, I don't know if that's elsewhere in the world, but a BioBlitz is essentially a group of professional biologists, often from a museum or from our land care research universities, sort of attending an event where they just go with groups out, small groups of adults and children, to go out and look for birds, look for plants, look for invertebrates, look for spiders, and you just tally up what you can find within a set time period. And if that's repeated, obviously not too often, but you just generate that interest. And so that's been very successful in New Zealand, the BioBlitz.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So some good and interesting answers there. Now we take the first question. It's a live question, so it's from, and excuse me if I don't pronounce the name right, Onke Ndeta. It's a live question, so please wait a second while we unmute you.
Hi, Anton, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, the question was for Edmund. So he partly answered the question there, but I was curious about how you were raising funds for your initiative. I mean, I'm calling from South Africa, and I mean, your situation is a bit different because you're looking at transformed landscapes. But I was more curious to know how you maintain the interest of donors and to ensure that they continue funding your initiative, but also looking at how you compete for funding with other areas, especially your high biodiversity areas, your global biodiversity hotspots. Thanks.
Yeah, we have a whole range of income, money from donors, so private, for families who donate money to us, people who have a legacy. After their death, they donate us money, and sometimes that are really huge amounts of. In earlier times, we always say it went to the church, but nowadays nature is for a lot of people more important than heaven afterwards, I think. We get money from the lottery. We get money from industries, because they want their people to live in a nice area. So for them, it's also an economical decision, but they choose us, so that's really, really nice. The lottery I already told you, so we have a big spread, a large spread of income. Never choose one, because then you are very, that is dangerous. When the one collapses, you have nothing. So we have quite a lot. And it's every year a lot of work to get the money in, but when the money isn't there, we can't do the projects. We have a very low normal budget for our normal work, and all the rest are projects. So when we have money, we start a project. When we have money for another restoration, we start a restoration. When the money isn't there, We wait for a year or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. So you have to be patient. Is that the answer you're looking for?
Well, Edmund, I think Anke Metzer also wanted to know how you keep people interested in giving you money rather than giving money to their money to spectacular projects in for instance, developing countries where it's elephants and rhinos.
Normally I don't, I don't think in competition. Oh, that's the question. There are quite a lot of people. We did some investigation about why people giving money. A lot of people who are member of our foundation are also member of the World Wildlife Fund or give money for lions or whatever. So it's a way of life. And so it's not a choose only for in the neighborhood or the other parts of the world, but we noticed, and that's the reason why we are there, that Natuurmonumenten, as I told you, the NGO which works countrywide, loses customers because they want the money to be spent in their environment, in their neighborhood. And that's where our foundation is for. So they can choose for the whole country or they can choose for us. And when they want the World Wildlife Fund, they can pay for projects in South Africa or whatever. And you have to be good. You have to produce real good projects. Then people see where the money is spent and then they give other money. That's how it works.
Okay. That was your question, Anke Metzer. So now the next question is also live. It's from Angelo Salzi. So again, wait a minute while we unmute you.
So you should hear me now, I think, right?
Yes.
So first thing, thanks a lot, Anton, and thanks to your guest. In 1 hour, you made us travel across the globe, and we visited really beautiful spots everywhere. And I love dealing with nature conservation people because you understand policy, strategy, and all these kind of things. But then at the end of the day, you bring practical examples that have been done on the ground. Now, the question was for Natasha. You have explained us a bit about the stewardship program and this network of sites. I would like to know what is maybe you said it and I missed it, what is the extent of this network in terms of even comparing it to the nationally or publicly protected land like national parks and so on. And apart from all these services or facilities that these people receive if they engage in the stewardship program, do they get any sort of fiscal discounts, any other sort of financial benefits? Do they get into a contractual relation with a land trust that will make sure that the long-term commitment is guaranteed? So that's a bit about, yeah.
Oh, Anton, I'll go for it, if you can all hear me.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So in South Africa, there is still majority of land that is conserved is state-owned land. The stewardship work started in 2003, and it takes quite a lot of time before you sign up agreements with landowners. But between 2009 and 2016, more than 2/3 of the land that was declared as protected area was done under the stewardship program. So in the last few years, we've seen a huge uptake of the stewardship work to the point where our provincial agencies actually have to start slowing down because they don't have the capacity to manage all of the interest coming from the landowners. So that's in terms of the extent of the stewardship network. It is active in all of the provinces, 9 provinces in South Africa. And then in terms of the fiscal benefits and contractual agreements, depending on the level of commitment from the landowner and the level of biodiversity importance, we enter into agreements with the landowners. The highest level includes a declaration, a long-term agreement, anything from 30 to 99 years or in perpetuity. That is if it's really high biodiversity and the commitment from the landowner is quite strong. In addition to that, some municipalities do offer a rates rebate if you have entered into a biodiversity stewardship contract. And if you are on the highest tier for the longest period of time with the most important biodiversity, you do qualify or could qualify for a tax incentive, which I won't go into now, but those are some of the fiscal benefits available to landowners. Thanks, Anton.
Okay, the next question is also for Natasha and kind of follows on from the previous question. It's from Charles Chester. So it's live, so we'll please wait to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Well, sure. I'm just very interested in the community protected area in South Africa, and I'm just wondering if you've had any experience with that that you've learned from where it was fully fledged and came into existence, but for reasons of funding or for land use conflict, it failed. If so, why, and what lessons did you take from that?
So we are still learning. This is a new area of work for us. Many CPAs in the country are struggling. Not as many are as successful as the one that I shared with you. I think that the reason they're struggling is, firstly, it's a new area of work that we're still trying to find our way around. And so there's lots of lessons and school fees to be paid in terms of understanding exactly how to work with our communities and make their CPAs work. There's another issue around governance, trying to get a big group of people with different goals and objectives to manage a piece of land together and make decisions together is really tricky. And so the sharing of power and decision making and a lot of conflict within CPAs and within the communities do make moving forward very difficult, because if you want to engage with communities with the stewardship work, they all need to be on board, they all need to understand what's involved, and they all need to be prepared to move forward together. And it's very difficult to get communities to do that. Another issue is that the land that gets transferred to CPAs is often state land, so government land, and it's quite an onerous process to have land transferred to communities, to transfer title deeds to them and to give them ownership. And once they receive ownership, they need business training, good governance training, conservation training, understanding of what to do with their land. And then also unfortunately, as I mentioned, not a lot of our land is arable. And so you need to look at what is the economic opportunities that piece of land presents. And not all land is going to be awesome for a Big Five game reserve, for example. And so all of those different things make it a little bit tricky to be successful. But it is an ongoing piece of work, and we learn as we go along. Anton?
Right, thank you. The next question is not to be asked live, so I'm going to read it out. It's definitely a question for Mel, but I would suggest that if Edmund and Natasha also want to come in on this one, please do, because there's... So the question is, do some communities without local leaders and capacities to make partnerships get left behind? Do volunteers burn out? Mel, you should have experience with volunteer burnout.
Yes, yes. Perhaps the first part of the question is a lot of the projects that involve community groups, of course, are initiated by the community. So there will be communities that are missing out if there's no incentive to, or no person to start it. A lot of the projects do start with one or two individuals. So if there's no one with that particular philosophy, yes, the areas could miss out. Do volunteers burn out? Well, they certainly do, and certainly can. And I guess what stops them initially is the quality of the rewards they get, because that's what keeps them going. But the big issue is is a magnitude issue with size. So Tiri supporters, for example, now has assets over $1 million. Their income is largely, or the huge income is from the concession from guidings, and they do run a shop as well. But the main problem, they're in a position where they've got enough funding to employ people to do some of the administrative work. So the problem is that transition between being too small to employ someone and then being big enough to employ someone. In between that is when the burnout happens, because the responsibilities to manage that amount of money are huge. And as you can imagine, there's lots of administration work. And if they're volunteers doing this, well, generally, there are a lot that are retired, but other people still have their day job to do. And so that's when burnout occurs, as the organisation reaches that critical mass to switch to employed people. Okay.
Good. Right. So you, Edmund, Natasha, don't want to come in on this one? Otherwise, I go to the next question.
No, I agree with Mel. Recognize those experiences.
Good. Okay, we have time for one more question. It's another question which is not live, so I'll read it out. And this one, I think I'll just throw it at you, and either you say no, you'll soon find out why, or if it does apply to your organization, then you go for it. So here we go. Do the organizations have stewardship endowments, and what percentage of the organization annual operating budget comes from such endowments? Where did the money come from to create such stewardship endowments? So if it applies to your organization, go for it.
No, not to ours.
Anton, can you help me with, I don't have the translation for endowment. Is that a money which is for a special purpose?
Yes, if you like, it's like an example would be, for instance, that I have a huge amount of money, unless I'm Bill Gates, and then I leave like $100 million or $1 million in a bank account and say this money is to be used, or the income from the money is to be used for like.
Oh, that's that kind of funds. Yeah,
of heathlands, for instance. That's an endowment.
No, yeah, we have some donors who donated quite an amount of money. No, really a lot of money. Some because of they can prevent them from paying taxes, so they donate it to us, and they can use it instead of paying taxes. And most of the time they leave us with the money, and we can do whatever we want with it. But we have a few of them which told us you are only allowed to buy nature reserves in this area. So you can combine one nature reserve with the other one as a sort of connection. And we have 3 of those funds, and that's really nice. My colleagues can watch out if there is a nature reserve for sale or agricultural grounds for sale. We can develop nature over there. So we have some funds, yes, but not as much if you would like to ask.
Right. Natasha, in South Africa, anything at all like that?
Yeah, there are definitely endowment funds, but it's mostly in the NGO sector and not so much in the government sphere, which I'm focusing on now. But yeah, we do definitely have endowments, endowment funds and land trusts that get managed, donors who put money aside. But it's not so much in my current sphere, but mostly in the NGO space.
Okay, well, now it is it's time. We have to close this webinar. In fact, this is the last webinar in the series of ILCN, ELCN have been hosting since Earth Day, April the 22nd, when our 4th Congress was supposed to have started in Barcelona. COVID-19 disrupted all that. Yet the 10 webinars held since then show the robustness of the ILCN, ELCN network. We've sidestepped lockdowns and travel bans and shared our experiences and thoughts. A big thank you, Lincoln Institute, Jim Levitt, for enabling and coordinating all this. Special thanks to Chandni and Robin for preparing and running each webinar so smoothly. How could we have ever managed without you? Thank you, Edmund, Mel, Natasha, and all the panelists and presenters in the webinars before you for investing time and effort to give us such a fascinating menu of interesting and inspiring stories. And last but no means least, thank you, audience, for tuning in and listening, looking, asking questions. So we now break for summer or winter, that depends on where you are. The ILCN ELCN Congress has been postponed to next April, so maybe we'll meet again there physically. But we are considering in the ILCN another round of webinars in the run-up to this Congress, starting somewhere in the autumn, the fall, or spring if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. So watch the space. Until we meet again, all the best, take care, and above all, here's to your health. Cheers.
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 Yes.